Now, as reported by Neil Wallace in Farmers Weekly, there's been a dispute over the volume of carbon sequestered on sheep and beef farms all around the methodology adopted between the two pieces of research and reporting on it. Initially, there was a claim that 1.4 million hectares of native forest on sheep and beef property was of significant value to our ability to sequester carbon. However, that was commissioned by the Auckland AUT and by the Beef and Lamb New Zealand. But Ministry for the Environment has come out and said, hang on a minute, it's about a third of that. I'm not quite sure what calculator you're using. But standing beside the research that was peer-reviewed is Chief Executive of Beef and Lamb New Zealand, Sam McIvor, who joins us now. Sam, good evening.
Good evening.
Hey, so Sam, why did Beef and Lamb decide to go down and put some research about the ability to sequester carbon from our existing native forests on sheep and beef farms prior to our advice from our Climate Commission?
It probably goes back 2 or 3 years, Sarah, where we developed our environmental strategy at Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and there was 4 goals in it, really. One was around carbon neutral by 2050. Second one was water that we can swim in and gather food in. The third one was enhancing our biodiversity. And the fourth one was healthy, productive soils. And really our journey in this research started off around that biodiversity aspect, because when we looked at sheep and beef farms, we just saw how much native bush and regenerating bush was on those farms. And so the first study we actually did with Canterbury University was to identify just how much of that indigenous bush was on sheep and beef farms. And there was a couple of key figures that came out of it. And, you know, researchers use very technical words, don't they? So 2.8 million hectares of woody vegetation on sheep and beef farms. And that boiled down to 1.4 million hectares of native bush. So the natural step to go beyond that, as we started to think about climate change, and we started to think about the government putting obligations on farmers to either reduce their emissions or pay their way, the next natural question was to say, well, if we know all of this bush is sitting on farms, we do know that it sequests carbon. How much is actually happening? And so that led us to the report with Auckland University, which was peer-reviewed as well, where that identified that I think it was anywhere at the lowest, it was 60% of emissions were being offset, and at the very highest limit was somewhere like up to 118%. So there was quite a range that was identified there, just depending on how they categorise the bush and the sequestration rates.
Mm. And that's the thing too, is because there is so much differing discussion I hear around what sequesters carbon and what doesn't, and shelter belts and riparian planting is the ones that are under question. But my thoughts, and I didn't do a degree in ag sci or any type of science degree to know that simply a plant needs carbon to sequester carbon for growth, and if anything's growing, does it not mean that it's sequestering?
So I think this is you know, you've hit on the key thing, right? Is that intuitively we know that when we've got plants out there, regardless of how big these plants are, they will be sequestering some carbon, right? And we also know that in New Zealand, if you think of the national parks, right? We've got massive native in our national parks. And then I think outside of the national parks, sheep and beef farmers have about 27% of the native bush. So we know that stuff is happening. The question, or that we know the sequestration is happening. The question is how much, really? And it's a really critical question for us to answer, because if we think about the status of New Zealand's commitments to climate change, we think about this sheep and beef farms, getting that native bush figure right and the amount of sequestration that's happening is really, really important for both the nation and for individual farmers. And you can see with what MfE has put out, with what AUT has put out in the range there's obviously quite a bit of work to be done to settle on a formula that actually we're all comfortable with. And the point that you made, Sarah, about whether it's shelter belts or riparian strips, yes, we know that is happening. The trouble at the moment is that our system of assessing the sequestration is just not granular enough to grab that stuff.
Oh, I mean, we even talk about that hemp has the ability to sequester 4 times the amount of a pine tree. I'm sure this isn't included in calculations as well. And the thing is, Sam, is we've got He Waka Eke Noa, but is He Waka Eke Noa running fast enough to keep up with the ability for farmers to know their number, but actually trust their number?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah. I think we need to put in context where we are on the journey, right? With He Waka Eke Noa, our first thing is for farmers to have a reasonable idea of what their status is. So I think it's by the end of this year, 25% of farmers need to know their number, so to speak. By the end of next year, we want every farmer to know their number. And so one of the things that Beef and Lamb New Zealand is doing at the moment, alongside some of the commercial tools, MfE's tool, is building a simple tool that farmers can use based on their stock reconciliation, based on their assessment of bush, which will have a ready retina with it, to just get to that starting point to say, in the scheme of things, roughly where do I sit? Because it's not going to be until, 2025, that farmers are actually going to have an obligation to pay, so to speak, if that's what ends up happening. So the important thing today, get on the journey, roughly understand where you're at, and then start to look at some of the tools that you have at your disposal, planting native bush, whether it is putting in a pine plantation, whether it is changing your stock system, whether it is using genetics, starting to examine those tools that are available to farmers now.
Where is the likes of Harry Clark and the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre stance between the two differing views?
To be honest, I haven't had a detailed talk with Harry over that, but obviously the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, which is a long name, isn't it? They're a really important resource for the industry. And I guess, just what our work, along with MfE's work, has reinforced is, guys, we've got to crack on, and we've got to get decent numbers and decent methodology that we're going to settle on for this, because at the end of the day, farmers need certainty around where they're going to go, and we need the right figures for our national stats.
But it is concerning when the science is not keeping up with regulation, Sam, when the scientists themselves have said that we're not there yet in terms of our knowledge of sequestration, and we haven't even had the discussion of a national soil mapping process to actually make the claim whether our soils are full of carbon or not. So it's a very, very difficult thing to have in parallel.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Sarah. And one of the things that we're very conscious of, I guess climate change is the big game in town for New Zealand at the moment, isn't it? It's the one that there's a lot of commitment to. There's a lot of momentum globally now, and doing our part is really important. And so for me, one of the really important things from a Beef and Lamb New Zealand perspective is that across government and industry, we have a very clear strategy around research investment. So obviously we, along with DairyNZ, with Fonterra and commercial companies and MPI, have invested in the Pastoral Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. Now we're at a pivot point now where we've come. I think it's been going since 2003. We're at a pivot point now where we're deciding where do we go next, and certainly from a PGRC perspective, we're looking at the whole gambit of research, because it's important that whatever PGGRC is doing fits with NZAGRC, fits with other research that might be going on in our CIS investment that the government should be making. So from my perspective, and I think the Climate Commission really pointed to this as well, Sarah, is that there is a real need for a joined up strategy across government and across industry on what our investment strategy is going to be around greenhouse gas research for the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Sam, I just want to end on International Women's Day and the wonderful influence that women have within Beef and Lamb.
Yeah, well, you probably know the stats, do you? 63% of our staff are women. Well, if you look at our farming industry, 50% of our farmers are women. We've been really pleased to get behind the Meat Business Women initiative, which was created by actually somebody out of Beef and Lamb New Zealand, along with the UK partnership. They play a tremendously valuable role. We've been a long-time supporter of Agri Women's Development Trust, and personally, I believe that program is probably going to be one of the most transformational programs for our sector in the last 5 years and for the next 20 years as well. I just can't speak highly enough of that program.
Oh, thanks, Sam. I thought there would be some important words from you on that because, it's absolutely incredible how many wonderful women work for Beef and Lamb across the board, and I have the pleasure of knowing them very, very well, and they do a freaking awesome job, as well as, of course, all the males that work in Beef and Lamb as well.
I'm very proud of them too.
Thank you so much, Chief Executive for Beef and Lamb New Zealand, Sam McIvor, and of course all the stories are on farmersweekly.co.nz and in your rural mailbox today across the country with your fresh newspaper ready for you with the in-depth journalism that this fantastic organisation brings to the table.